Talking about our constitution since last few days. Now I am going to start a part of nature of the federal system. This is also a part of our constitution of India. India, a union of states. Article 1 of our constitution says India, that is Bharat, shall be union of states. While submitting the draft constitution, Dr. Ambedkar, the chairman of the drafting committee, stated that although its constitution may be federal in structure, the committee has used the term union because of certain advantages. These advantages, he explained in the Constituent Assembly, were to indicate two things. As for example, that is the Indian Federation is not the result of an agreement by the units, and that the component units have no freedom to secede from it. The word union, of course, does not indicate any particular type of federation, inasmuch it is used also in the preamble of the Constitution of the Union States, the model of federation in the preamble of the British and North America Act, which according to the Lord Halden did not create a true federation at all. In the preamble to the Union of South Africa Act 1909, which patently set up a unitary constitution, and even in the Constitution of the USSR, which formally acknowledges a right of secession, Article 72, to each republic that is unit of the Union. We have therefore to examine the provisions of the Constitution itself, apart from the label given to it by the draftsman, to determine whether it provides a federal system as claimed by Dr. Ambedkar, particularly in view of its criticism, as will be presently seen labeled against the federal claim by some foreign scholars. The difficulty of any treatment of federalism is that there is no agreed definition of the federal state. The other difficulty is that it is habitual with scholars on the subject to start with the model of the United States, the oldest 1787 of all federal constitutions in the world, and to exclude any system that does not conform to the model from the nomenclature of federation. But numerous countries in the world have since 1787 adopted constitutions having federal features, and if the strict historical standard of the United States be applied to all these later constitutions, few will stand the test of federalism save perhaps Switzerland and Australia. Nothing is, however, gained by excluding so many recent constitutions from the federal class, for according to the traditional classification followed by the political scientists, constitutions are either unitary or federal. It is if therefore a constitution partakes of some features of both types, the only alternative is to analyze those features and to ascertain whether it is basically unitary or federal. Although it may be subsidiary variations, a liberal attitude towards the question of federalism is therefore inevitable, particularly in view of the fact that recent experiments in the world of constitution making are departing more and more from the pure type of either unitary or a federal system. The author's view on the subject, expressed in the previous edition of this book as well as in the commentary on the Constitution of India, now finds support from the categorical assertion of the research worker on the subject of federalism, who happens to be the American himself, that the question whether a state is federal or unitary is one of degrees, and the answer will depend upon how many federalist features it possesses. Another American scholar has in the same strain observed that the federation is more a functional than an institutional concept, and that any theory which asserts that there are certain inflexible characteristics without which a political system cannot be federal ignores the fact that institutions are not the same things in different social and cultural environments. To anticipate the author's conclusion, the constitutional system of India is basically federal, but of course with the striking unitary features. In order to come to this conclusion, we have to formulate the essential minimal features of the federal system as to which there is common agreement amongst political scientists. Though there may be difference amongst scholars in the matters of detail, the consensus of opinion is that a federal system involves the following essential features: dual government. While in a unitary state there is only one government, namely the national government, in the federal state there are two governments, the national or federal government and the government of each component state. Though a unitary state may create local subdivisions, such local authorities enjoy an autonomy of their own but exercise only such powers as are from time to time delegated to them by the national government, and it is competent for the national government to revoke and the delegated powers or any of them at its will. A federal state, on the other hand, is the fusion of several states into a single state in regard to matters affecting common interest, while each component state enjoys autonomy in regard to other matters. The component states are not mere delegates or agents of the federal government, but both the federal and state governments draw their authority from the same source, viz. The constitution of land. On the other hand, a component state has no right to secede from the federation at its will. This distinguishes a federation from a confederation. Distribution of powers. It follows that very object for which a federal state is formed involves a division of authority between the federal government and the states. Though the method of distribution may not be alike in the federal constitution, supremacy of the constitution. A federal state derives its existence from the constitution, just as a corporation derives its existence from the grant of a statute by which it is created. Every power, executive, legislative or judicial, whether it belongs to the federation or to the component states, is subordinate to and controlled by the constitution. Authority of courts. In a federal state, the legal supremacy of the constitution is essential to the existence of the federal system. It is essential to maintain the division of powers not only between the coordinate branches of the government but also between the federal government and the states themselves. This is secured by vesting in the courts a final power to interpret the constitution and nullify and action on the part of the federal and state governments or their different organs which violates the provisions of the constitution. Not much pains need to be taken to demonstrate that the political system introduced by our constitution possesses all the aforesaid essentials of a federal polity. Thus the constitution is the supreme organic law of our land, and both the union of the state governments as well as their respective organs derive their authority from the constitution, and it is not competent for the states to secede from the union. There is division of legislative and administrative powers between the union and the state governments, and the Supreme Court stands at the head of our judiciary to jealously guard this distribution of powers and to invalidate any action which violates the limitation imposed by the constitution. This jurisdiction of the Supreme Court may be resorted to not only by a person who has been affected by the union or state law which according to him has violated the constitutional distribution of powers, but also by the union and the states themselves by bringing taking a direct action against each other before the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court under Article 131. It is because of the basic federal structure features that our Supreme Court has described the Constitution as federal. But though our Constitution provides these essential features of a federation, it differs from typical federal system of the world in the certain fundamental respects. The mode of formation, a federal union of the American type, is formed by the voluntary agreement between a number of sovereign and independent states for the administration of certain affairs of general concern. But there is an alternative mode of Canadian type if Canada is admitted into the family of federations, namely that the provinces of a unitary state may be transformed into a federal union to make themselves autonomous. The provinces of Canada had no separate or independent existence apart from the colonial government of Canada, and the union was not formed by any agreement between them, but was imposed by British statute, which withdrew from the provinces all their former rights and then redivided them between the Dominion and the provinces. Though the Indian Federation resembles the Canadian Federation in its centralizing tendency, it even goes further than the Canadian precedent. The federalism in India is not a matter of administrative convenience, but one of principle. India has a thoroughly centralized unitary constitution until the Government of India Act 1935. The provincial governments were virtually the agents of the central government, deriving powers by delegation from the latter. To appreciate the mode of formation of federation in India, we must go back to the Government of India Act 1935, which for the first time introduced the federal concept and used the expression Federation of India in a Constitution Act relating to India. Since the Constitution has simply continued the federal system so introduced by the Act of 1935, so far as the provinces of British India are concerned. By the Act of 1935, the British Parliament set up a federal system in the same manner as it had done in the case of Canada, viz. By creating autonomous units and combining them into a federation by one of the same act. All powers hereto exercised in India were resumed by the Crown and redistributed between the federation and the provinces by the direct grant. Under this system, the provinces derived their authority directly from the Crown and exercised legislative and executive powers broadly free from central control within a defined sphere. Nevertheless, the center retained control through the governor's special responsibilities and his obligation to exercise his individual judgment and discretion in certain matters, and the power of the center to give direction to the provinces. The peculiarity of thus converting a unitary system into a federal one can be best explained in the words of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Indian Reform. Of course, in thus converting a unitary state into a federation, we should be taking a step for which there is no exact historical precedent. Federations have commonly resulted from an agreement between independent or at least autonomous governments surrendering a defined part of their sovereignty or autonomy to a new central organism. At the present moment, the British Indian provinces are not even autonomous, for they are subject to both administrative and legislative control of the government, and such authority as they exercise has been in the main devolved upon them under a statutory rule-making power by the Government General in Council. We are faced with the necessity of creating autonomous units and combining them into the federation by one and the same act. It is well worth remembering this peculiarity of the origin of the federal system in India. Neither before nor under the Act of 1935 the provinces were in any sense sovereign states like the states of the American Union. The Constitution too has been framed by the people of India assembled in the Constituent Assembly, and the Union of India cannot be said to be the result of any compact or agreement between autonomous states so far as the provinces are concerned. The progress had been from a unitary to a federal organization, but even then this has happened not because the provinces desired to become autonomous units under the federal union. As in Canada, the provinces, as just seen, had been artificially made autonomous within the defined shape by Government of India Act 1935, which the makers of the Constitution did so was to associate the Indian states with these autonomous provinces into a federal union, which each Indian states had refused to accede to in 1935. Some amount of homogeneity of the federating units in a condition for their desire to form a federal union, but in India the position has been different from the earliest times. The Indian states had a separate political entity, and there was little that was common between them and the provinces which constituted the rest of India. Even under the federal scheme of 1935, the provinces and the Indian states were treated differently. The accession of the Indian states to the system was voluntary, while it was compulsory for the provinces, and the powers exercisable by the federation over the Indian states were also to be defined by the instruments of accession. It is because it was optional with the rulers of the Indian states that they refused to join the federal system of 1935. They lacked the federal sentiment, that is, the desire to form a federal union with the rest of India. But as already pointed out, the political situation changed with the lapse of paramountcy of the British Crown, as a result of which most of the Indian states acceded to the dominion of India on the eve of the independence of India. The credit to the makers of the Constitution therefore lies not too much in bringing the Indian states under the federal system, but in placing them as much as possible on the same footing as the other units of the federation under the same Constitution. In short, the survivors of the old Indian states in Part B 13 of the first schedule were, with minor exceptions, placed under the same political system as the old provinces it sits in Part A 13. The integration of the units of the two categories has eventually been completed by eliminating the separate entities of states in Part A and states in Part B, and replacing them by one category of states by the Constitution 7th Amendment Act 1956. Position of the states in the Federation. In the United States, since the states had a sovereign and independent existence prior to the formation of the Federation, they were reluctant to give up that sovereignty any further than what was necessary for forming a national government for the purpose of conducting their common purposes. As a result, the Constitution of the Federation contains a number of safeguards for the protection of state rights, for which there was no need in India, as the states were not sovereign entities before. These points of difference deserve particular attention. While the residuary powers are reserved to the states by the American Constitution, these are assigned to the Union by our Constitution, Article 248. This alone, of course, is not sufficient to put an end to the federal character of our political system, because it only relates to the mode of distribution of powers. Our Constitution has simply followed the Canadian system in vesting the residuary power in the Union. While the Constitution of the United States of America merely drew up the constitution of the national government, leaving it in the main to the state to continue to preserve their original constitution. The Constitution of India lays down the constitution for the state as well, and no state save Jammu and Kashmir has a right to determine its own constitution. In the matter of amendment of the constitution, again, the part assigned to the state is minor as compared with that of union. The doctrine underlying a federation of American type is that the union is the result of an agreement between the component units, so that no part of the constitution which embodies the compact can be altered without the consent of the covenanting parties. This doctrine is adopted with variation by most of the federal systems, but in India, except in a few specified matters affecting the federal structure, the states need not be consulted in the matter of amendments of the bulk of the constitution, which may be effected by a bill in the Union Parliament passed by a special majority. Though there is a division of powers between the Union and the states, there is provision in our Constitution for the exercise of control by the Union both over the administration and legislation of the states. Legislation by states shall be subject to disallowance by the President were reserved by the governor for his consideration. Again, the governors of a state shall be appointed by the President of the Union and shall hold office during the pleasure of the President. These ideas are repugnant to the Constitution of United States or of Australia, but are to be found in the Canadian Constitution. The American Federation has been described by its Supreme Court as an indestructible union composed of indestructible states. It comprises two propositions. The union cannot be destroyed by any state seceding from the union at its will. Conversely, it is not possible for the federal government to withdraw the map of the United States by forming new states or by altering the boundaries of the states as they existed in the time of the compact without the consent of the legislature of the states concerned. The same principle is adopted in the Australian Constitution to make the Commonwealth indissoluble, with the further safeguard superadded that a popular referendum is required in the affected state to alter its boundaries. It has been already seen that the first proposition has been accepted by the makers of our Constitution, and it is not possible for the states of the Union of India to exercise any right of secession. Sorry. It should not be noted in this context that by the 16th Amendment of the Constitution in 1963, it has been made clear that even advocacy of secession will not have the protection of the freedom of expression, but just the contrary of the second proposition had been embodied in our Constitution. Under our Constitution, it is possible for the Union Parliament to recognize the states or to alter their boundaries by a simple majority in the ordinary process of legislation. The Constitution does not require that the consent of the legislature of the states is necessary for enabling Parliament to make such laws. Only the President has to ascertain the views of the legislature of the affected states to recommend a bill for this purpose to Parliament. Even this obligation is not mandatory insofar as the President is competent to fix a time limit within which a state must express its views, if at all. Proviso to Article 3 as amended in the Indian Federation thus the states are not indestructible unit as in USA. The ease with which the federal organization may be reshaped by an ordinary legislation by the Union Parliament has been demonstrated by the enactment of the States Reorganization Act 1956, which reduced the number of states from 27 to 14 within a period of 6 years from the commencement of the Constitution. The same process of disintegration of existing states effected by unilateral legislation by Parliament has led to the formation subsequently of several new states: Gujarat, Nagaland, Haryana, Karnataka, Meghalaya, Himachal Pradesh, Manipur, Sikkim, Tripura, Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh, Goa. It is natural, therefore, that question might arise in foreign minds as to the nature of federalism introduced by the Indian Constitution. Not only does the Constitution offer no guarantee to the states against affecting their territorial integrity without their consent, there is no theory of equality of state rights underlying the federal scheme in our Constitution, since it is not the result of any agreement between the states. One of the essential principles of American federalism is the equality of the component states under the Constitution, irrespective of their size or population. This principle is reflected in the equality of representation of the states in the upper house of the federal legislature, that is the Senate, which is supposed to safeguard the status and interest of the states in the federal organization. To this is superadded the guarantee that no state may, without its consent, be deprived of its equal representation in the Senate. Article 5. Under our Constitution, there is no equality of representation of the states in the Council of States. As given in the 4th schedule, the number of members for the several states varies from 1 to 31. In view of such composition of the upper chamber, the federal safeguard against the interests of the lesser states being overridden by the interests of the larger or more populated states is absent under our Constitution. Nor can our Council of States be correctly described as a federal chamber insofar as it contains the nominated element of 12 members as against 238 representatives of state and union territories. Status of Sikkim. Another novel feature introduced into the Indian federalism was the admission of Sikkim as an associate state without being a member of the Union of India as defined in Article 1, which was made possible by the insertion of Article 2A into the Constitution by the Constitution 35th Amendment 1974. This innovation was, however, short-lived, and its legitimacy has lost all practical interest since all that was done by the 35th Amendment Act 1974 has been undone by the 36th Amendment Act 1975, by which Sikkim has been admitted into the Union of India as a full-fledged state under the first schedule with effect from 26th April 1975 under Chapter 6 post. The original federal scheme of the Indian Constitution comprising states and the Union territories has thus been left unimpaired. Of course, certain special provisions has been laid down in the new Article 317(1)(f) as regards Sikkim to meet the special circumstances of that state. Article 371(g) makes certain special provisions relating to the state of Mizoram, while Article 371(h) and 371(i) insert special provision for Arunachal Pradesh and Goa. Nature of the polity. As a radical solution of the problem of reconciling national unity with state rights, the framers of the American Constitution made a logical division of everything essential to sovereignty and created a dual polity with a dual citizenship, a double set of official and a double system of courts. An American is a citizen not only of the state in which he resides but also the United States, that is, of the Federation, under different conditions, and both the federal and state governments, each independent of the other, operate directly upon the citizen, who is the subject to two governments and owes allegiance to both. But Indian Constitution, like the Canadian, does not introduce any double citizenship but one citizenship, which the citizenship of India and birth or residence in a particular state does not confer any separate status as a citizen of the state. As regards officials, similarly, the federal and state governments in the United States have their own officials to administer their respective laws and functions, but there is no such division amongst the public officials in India. The majority of the public servants are employed by the states, but they administer both the union of the state laws as are applicable to their respective states by which they are employed. Our Constitution provides for the creation of all India services, but they are to be common to union and states. Members of Indian Administrative Service appointed by the union may be employed either under some union department, say Home or Defense, or under the state government, and their services are transferable, and even when they are employed under a union government, they have to administer both the union and state laws as are applicable to the matter in question. But even while serving under a state, for the time being, a member of all India services can be dismissed or removed only by the union government, even though the state government is competent to initiate disciplinary proceedings for that purpose. In USA, there is bifurcation of the judiciary as between the federal and state government. Cases arising out of federal constitution and federal laws are tried by the federal courts, while state courts deal with cases arising out of state constitution and state laws. But in India, the same system of courts headed by the Supreme Court will administer both the union and state laws as they are applicable to the cases coming up for adjudication. The machinery for election, accounts, and audits is also similarly integrated. The Constitution of India empowers the Union to entrust its executive functions to a state by its consent, Article 258, and a state to entrust its executive function to the Union. Similarly, Article 258A, no question of surrender of sovereignty by one government to the other stands in the way of this smooth cooperative arrangement. While the federal system is prescribed by normal times, the Indian Constitution enables the federal government to acquire the strength of a unitary system in emergencies. While in normal times the Union Executive is entitled to give directions to the state governments in respect of specified matters, when a proclamation of emergency is made, the power to give directions extends to all matters, and the legislative power of the Union extends to state subjects. Article 353, 354, 357. The wisdom of these emergency provisions relating to external aggression as distinguished from internal disturbance has been demonstrated by the fact that during the Chinese aggression of 1962 or the Pakistan aggression of 1965, India could stand as one man, pooling all the resources of the states, notwithstanding the federal organization. Even in the normal working, the federal system is given the strength of a unitary system by endowing the union with much exclusive power of legislation, as has been found necessary in other countries to meet the ever-growing national exigencies, and over the above that, by enabling the union legislature to take up some become subject of state competence if required in the national interest. Thus, even apart from emergencies, the Union Parliament may assume legislative power though temporarily over any subject included in the state list if the Council of State's second chamber of Parliament resolves by a 2/3 vote that such legislation is necessary in the national interest. Article 249. There is of course a federal element in this provision inasmuch as such expansion of the power of union into the state sphere is possible only with the consent of the Council of States where the states are represented. But in actual practice, it will mean an additional weapon in the hands of the union vis-a-vis the states so long as the same party has a solid majority in both the houses of the union parliament. Even though there is distribution of powers between the union and states as under the federal system, the distribution has a strong central bias. The powers of states are hedged in with various restrictions which impede their sovereignty even within the sphere limited to them by the distribution of powers basically provided by the Constitution. By empowering the union government to issue directions upon the state governments to ensure due compliance with the legislative and administrative actions of the union, Article 256 to 257, and to supersede a state government which refuses to comply with such direction, Article 365. By empowering the President to withdraw to union the executive and legislative powers of the state under the Constitution if he is at any time satisfied that the administration of the state cannot be carried on in the normal manner in accordance with the provision of Constitution. Owing to political or other reasons, Article 356, from the federal standpoint, this seems to be anomalous in as much as the constitution makers did not consider it necessary to provide for any remedy whatever for the similar breakdown of the constitutional machinery at the center. Hence, the Panikkar is justified in observing the constitution itself has created a kind of paramountcy for the center by providing for the suspension of state governments and the imposition of president's rule under certain conditions such as the breakdown of the administration. Secondly, the power to suspend the constitutional machinery may be exercised by the president not only on the report of the governor of the state concerned but also suo motu whenever he is satisfied that the situation calling for the exercise of this power has arisen. It is thus a coercive power available to the union against the units of the federation. But though the above scheme seeks to avoid the demerits of the federal system, there is perhaps such an emphasis on the strength of the union government as affects the federal principle as it is commonly understood. Thus, a foreign critic, Professor Weir, was led to observe that Indian Constitution provides a system of government which is quasi-federal, a unitary state with subsidiary federal features rather than a federal state with subsidiary unitary features. In his later work in Modern Constitution, he puts it generically thus: in the class of quasi-federal constitution, it is probably proper to include the Indian Constitution of 1950. Professor Alexandrovich has taken great pains to combat the view that the Indian Federation is quasi-federation. He seems to agree with this author when he says that India is a case sui generis, This is in accord with the author's observation that the Constitution of India is neither purely federal nor purely unitary, but is a combination of both. It is union or composite state of a novel type. It enshrines the principle that in spite of federalism, the national interest ought to be paramount. In fact, anybody who impartially studies the Indian Constitution from close quarters and acknowledges that political science today admits of different variations of the federal system cannot but observe that the Indian system is extremely federal, as that it is a federation with a strong centralizing tendency. Strictly speaking, any deviation from American model of pure federation would make a system quasi-federal, and if so, the Canadian system too can hardly escape being branded as quasi-federal. The difference between the Canadian and the Indian system lies in the degree and extent of unitary emphasis. The real test of the federal character of a political structure is, as Professor Weir has himself observed, that however in what appears on paper only, it remains to be seen whether in actual practice the federal features entrench and or strengthen themselves as they have in Canada, or whether the strong trend towards centralization, which is the feature of most Western governments in the world, is crisis, will compel these federal aspects of the Constitution to wither away. A survey of the actual working of our Constitution for the last 50 years would hardly justify the conclusion that even though the unitary bonds have in some respects been further tightened, the federal features have altogether withered away. In some scholars in India have urged that the unitary bias of our Constitution has been accentuated in its actual working by two factors so much so that very little is left of federalism. These two factors are the overwhelming financial power of the Union and the utter dependence of the states upon Union grants for discharging their functions. The comprehensive sweep of the Union Planning Commission set up under the concurrent power over planning. The criticism may be justified in points of degree, but not in principle, for two reasons. Both these controls are aimed at securing a uniform development of the country as a whole. It is true that the bigger states are not allowed to appropriate all their resources, and the system of assignment and distribution of tax resources by Union, Article 269, 270, 272 means the dependence of the states upon the Union to a large extent, but left alone the stronger and bigger states might have left the smaller ones lagging behind to the detriment of our national strength. Even in the country like United States, such factors have in practice strengthened the national government to a degree which could not have been dreamt of by the fathers of the Constitution. Curiously enough, the same complaint as in India has been raised in the United States. Thus, of the centralizing power of federal grants, an American writer has observed, here is an attack on federalism so subtle that it is scarcely realized. Control of economic life and of these social services, which unemployment, old age, maternity and child welfare were the two major functions of a state and the local government. The first has largely passed into national hands, the second seems to be passing. If these both go, what we shall have left of the state autonomy will be a hollow shell, a symbol. In fact, the traditional theory of mutual independence of the two governments, federal and states, has given way to cooperative federalism in most of the federal countries today. An American scholar explains the concept of cooperative federalism in these words: the practice of administrative cooperation between general and regional governments, the partial dependence of the regional governments upon payments from the general governments, and the fact that the general government, by the use of conditional grants, frequently promote developments in matters which are constitutionally assigned to the regions. Hence, the system of federal cooperation existing under the Indian Constitution through allocation by the Union of the taxes collected or direct grants or allocation of plan funds do not necessarily militate against the concept of federalism, and that is why the Granville Austin prefers to call Indian federalism a cooperative federalism which produces a strong central government, yet it does not necessarily result in weak provincial government that are largely administrative agencies for central policies. In fact, the federal system in the Indian Constitution is a compromise between two apparently conflicting considerations. There is a normal division of powers under which the state enjoy autonomy within their own spheres with the power to raise revenue. The need of the national integrity and the strong union government, which the saner section of the people still consider necessary after 50 years of working of the Constitution. The interplay of the foregoing two forces has been acknowledged even by the Supreme Court in interpreting various provisions of the Constitution, as for example in explaining the significance of Article 301, Article 30. Thus, the evolution of the federal structure or a quasi-federal structure necessarily involved in the context of the conditions then prevailing a distribution of powers, and a basic part of our Constitution relates to that distribution with the three legislative lists of the 7th schedule. The Constitution itself says by Article 1 that the India is a union of states, and in interpreting the Constitution one must keep in the view of the essential structure of a federal or quasi-federal constitution, namely that the units of the union have also certain powers as has the union itself. In evolving an integrated policy on this subject, our constitution makers seem to have kept in mind three main considerations. First, in the larger interest of the India, there must be a free flow of trade, commerce and intercourse, both interstate and intra-state. Second, the regional interests must not be ignored altogether. And third, there must be a power of intervention by the Union in case of crisis to deal with particular problems that may arise in any part of India. Therefore, in interpreting the relevant articles in Part 13, we must have regard to the general scheme of the Constitution of India, with a special reference to Part 3, Part 12, and their interrelation to the Part 13 in the context of a federal or quasi-federal constitution, in which the states have certain powers, including the powers to raise revenues for their purposes by taxation. At the same time, there is no denying the fact that the states have occasionally smarted against central dominion over the states in their exclusive sphere, even in normal times, through the Planning Commission, which itself was not recognized by the construction, like the Finance Commission, the Public Service Commission, or the like. But this is not because the Constitution is not federal in its structure, or that its provisions envisage unitary control. The defect is political, namely that it is the same party which dominates both the union and state governments, and that naturally complaints of discrimination and interference with state autonomy are more common in those states which happens to be for the time being under the rule of a party different from that of the union government. The remedy, however, lies through the ballot box. It is through political forces again that the union government may be prevented from so exercising its constitutional powers as to assume an unhealthy paternalism. But that is beyond the ken of the present work. The remedy for a too frequent use of the power to impose president's rule in the state under Article 356 is also political. The strong central bias has, however, been a boon to keep India together when we find the separatist forces of communalism, linguism, and scramble for power playing havoc, notwithstanding all the devices of central control. Even after 5 decades of the working of the Constitution, it also shows that the states are not really functioning as agents of the union government or under the directions of the latter. For then, even events like those in Assam over the language problem or territorial dispute between Karnataka and Maharashtra could not have taken place at all. That the federal system has not withered away owing to the increasing impact of central bias would be evidenced by a number of circumstances which cannot be overlooked. See further chapter 33 post. The most conclusive evidence of the survival of the federal system in India is the coexistence of the government of the parties in the states that different from that of center. Of course, the reference of the Kerala Education Bill by President for the advisory opinion of the Supreme Court instead of giving his assent to the bill in the usual course has been criticized in Kerala as an undue interference with the constitutional rights of the state. But thanks to the wisdom and impartiality of the Supreme Court, the opinion delivered by the court was prompted by a purely legalistic outlook free from any political consideration, so that the federal system may reasonably be expected to remain unimpaired notwithstanding changes in the party situation, so long as the Supreme Court discharges its duties as a guardian of the Constitution. The federalism is not dead in India is also evidenced by the fact that new regions are constantly demanding statehood, and that already the union had to yield a much demand in the cases of Meghalaya, Nagaland, Manipur, Tripura, Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh, Goa, Chhattisgarh, Uttaranchal, and Jharkhand. Another evidence is the strong agitation for greater financial power for the states. The case for greater autonomy for the states in all respects was first launched by Tamil Nadu as a lone crusader, but in October 1983 it was joined by the states ruled by non-Congress parties, forming an opposition conclave. Though all the parties were not prepared to go to the same extent, the enlargement of state powers at the cost of the union in the political sphere is not, however, shared by other states on the ground that a weaker union will be a danger to external security and even internal cohesion in present day circumstances. But there is consensus among the states in general that they should have larger financial powers than those conferred by the existing constitution if they are to efficiently discharge their development programs within the state's sphere. Under list 2 of the 7th schedule, the Morarji Desai government 1977 sought to pacify the states by conceding substantial grants by way of plan assistance by what has been called the Desai Award. It is doubtful, however, whether the agitation for larger constitutional powers in respect of finance will be set at rest by such ad hoc palliatives. It is interesting to note that the suggestion in the previous edition of this book that the remedy perhaps lay in setting up a commission for the revision of the constitution, so that the question of finance may be taken up along with the responsibilities of the union and the states on a more comprehensive perspective, has borne fruit in the appointment in March 1983 of a one-man commission headed by an ex-Supreme Court judge, Sarkaria Justice, empowered to recommend changes in the center-state relations in view of the various developments which have taken place since the commencement of the Constitution. The Commission submitted its report in 1988. The Supreme Court referred to the report in S.R. Bommai. The proper assessment of the federal scheme introduced by our Constitution is that it introduces a system which is to normally work as a federal system, but there are provisions for converting it into a unitary or quasi-federal system under specified exceptional circumstances. But the exceptions cannot be held to have overshadowed the basic and normal structure. The exceptions are no doubt unique and numerous, but in cases where the exceptions are not attached, federal provisions are to be applied without being influenced by the existence of the exceptions. Thus, it will not be possible either for the union or a state to assume powers which are assigned by the Constitution to the other government unless such assumption is sanctioned by some provisions of the Constitution itself. Nor would such assumption or encroachment be violated by consent of the other party, for the Constitution itself provides the cases in which this is permissible by consent. Hence, apart from these exceptional cases, the Constitution would not permit any of the units of the Federation to subvert the federal structure set up by the Constitution, even by consent, nor would this be possible by delegation of powers by one legislature in favor of another. In fine, it may be reiterated that Constitution of India is neither purely federal nor purely unitary, but is a combination of both. It is a union or composite state of novel type. It enshrines the principle that in spite of federalism, the national interests ought to be paramount.